Good day, and welcome to another one of our Ranso's weekly wraps. As usual, what we'll do is discuss a few stories that occur in the week that will affect you and your investments. And also, we like to end up with a little AI, in this case, slash technology insert at the end, just to give you a little update on what's happening in the tech scene. So let us look at the stories of the week. First, we're going to discuss weird development in the UK banking sector. Then we're going to talk about the BOJ's decision, Bank of Japan, and finally we're going to end up with the Fed's rate announcement, as well as the ECB this week, and what that means for markets going forward. Okay, so let's start off with this banking scandal in the UK. Well, what we saw was a bit of a scandalous week, or a few days at least, in the UK, when Nigel Farage, for those that don't know, Nigel Farage was the guy that led the Brexit scheme. He's had a small party called UKIP, UK Independence Party. Not a huge player, but he's got a bigger role than his number of seats would indicate. He's been a very controversial figure in the UK. Now, what happened was the bank he was banking with, a bank called Coutts Bank, which is a subsidiary of NatWest Bank, cancelled his bank account. The official reason given was that he basically was too small a client to be a banking client for them. They were a very high net worth kind of bank, and he was considered to be just too small. But then some evidence emerged. Firstly, there's written evidence that when discussing his account, they brought up his politics. Like I said, he's a controversial figure in favor of Brexit. Right wing, as right wing as probably you can get in the UK without having trouble with the law, quite frankly. And he basically, once had access to these kind of things, was able to put pressure on the bank. He's been backed to a certain extent by the Conservative Party, which is obviously the ruling party at the moment in the UK. And what the result was is as follows. Firstly, the head of the CEO of NatWest basically resigned because she apparently commented to a BBC journalist about his account and revealed some personal information, which is of course a big no-no. And then the subsidiary bank Coutts as well also resigned as well. The CEO of that bank also resigned. And there's now pressure on the chairperson of NatWest overall to possibly resign as well. And this took off quite a bit of money off the valuation of NatWest. We're talking about like £1 billion or so, in the range of £1 billion. Huge amount of money. And what is interesting about this particular case is that I don't think this is going to be the end of the story. We're entering a point right now where corporates are becoming a battleground for the culture wars. We've seen, for instance, in the US, we've seen Ron DeSantis from Florida talk about the fact that ESG, as followed by companies out there, may be against the interest of shareholders. Specifically, in one case recently, he's come out and discussed, suing Bud Light owner AB InBev because he thinks that they basically have come out and effectively put their work politics, in inverted commas, ahead of shareholder interests, and because the state of Florida, through their pension fund, is a shareholder of the company, they have a right to sue the company for the kind of damage that has been done because of this decision to basically, all it was, quite frankly, was they gave them or they gave like a sponsorship, a rather small sponsorship. It was it was not a national ad or anything, to a trans influencer, and that was seen as being taking a culture war side, and that's actually been a huge cost to the company. The companies had to lay off like hundreds of workers because there's not enough demand anymore for Bud Light to justify them being employed. But this is another, I think, add-on to the kind of situation we think is going to be happening going forward, where more and more companies get caught up in these culture war fights and often, are going to be losing no matter what happens down the line. Because with regards to Bud Light, the Conservatives have gone after them and, caused massive sales. And when they did not back up their decision to support the trans influencer, the Liberals basically went after them as well. So on both sides, they were being hit by, accusations of bigotry or a number of other different things. So that's an interesting thing on the whole culture war side and how it's starting to affect businesses going forward. Okay, next we look at BOJ decision. BOJ basically did nothing. There's a hope that they'll be looking to raise interest rates, or the interest rate ceiling above like the 0.5% there right at the moment. That I think would be reasonable. However, the BOJ, what you have to understand, is treading a very tight line. Japan has a huge demographic issue that's going to make it very difficult for it to fulfill its obligations going forward. Yet at the same time, the Japanese currency is a bit of a barrier in terms of to the, I think the full tools. Is it more of a barrier to what the companies in Japan want in terms of their profits and ability to export, etc. We've also are seeing in a situation like this here, where because Japan has such a huge debt load, if the Bank of Japan had to raise interest rates a little bit, it might be quite difficult for the company to handle that debt load. For those that don't know, Japan is like the most indebted country in the world. It's like way more indebted than places that you think are very indebted, like the US, for instance. Japan's way worse than places like Greece, etc. So yeah, they decided to do nothing. Now, what does it mean? It means that they are the central bank, the major central bank of the world, has decided to basically ride out this interest rate, inflation problem at the moment, and just wait to see what happens. Inflation rose, slightly more than it was from the last period, like just over 3% basically. But when you have a 0% effective interest rate, 3% inflation is still, well above your interest rate, and you have a negative 3% interest rate. That's a huge amount of stimulation in the economy. Now, what the problem is going to be and what the resolution of Japan is going to be, I don't know. Every single long-term factor to me looks very negative in Japan. However, in the short term, there's a lot of value there. These companies in Japan are still making a lot of money. They're still exporting around the world. They're still leaders in their fields. So it's a balance between the long-term negativity and the short to medium-term positivity in Japan. And finally, we come to our rate decision. This week, the US raised it by quarter basis points as expected. They left open the possibility of raising again, but the market doesn't believe that. The market believes it's the last one, and that what we are likely to see from now onwards is some kind of move, maybe within the next 6 months or so, where the bank is, the Federal Reserve is going to come out and have to start cutting interest rates because the effect of the economy is just going to be too negative. Remember, when it comes to interest rates, you have a situation where the interest rate that you do today, or interest you do today, is going to affect your economy next year sometime. That's when that's the lag between the implementation and the actual effect. So we are still going to be experiencing, interest rate hikes from the start of this year well into next year, maybe until the end of next year, until the start of 2025. That means that we may have raised interest rates to a point that is going to be actually negative for the economy, but we haven't seen it yet because the impacts will come later on. And that means that when they do start seeing these negative impacts, they're going to start trying to drop interest rates in order to protect the economy from a recession. Now, in terms of what's happened here, and what I want you to understand is the following. Inflation right now in most of the world seems to be coming down quicker than expected, but there's factors that are working against it. Firstly, oil prices have risen sharply over the last couple of weeks. That's going to translate into a higher inflation rate for most countries in the world, especially in the developing world, but also in the emerging markets as well, especially the US. I mean, the US is a huge country. A lot of transport requires a lot of gasoline, and therefore we are going to be seeing a lot of demand for gasoline, petrol in the US, and if basically they're buying a lot of the stuff and the price goes up, that's going to affect inflation by even more. Okay, so yeah, this the current situation right now seems to be the Fed, ECB, etc., saying more hikes are possible. The market saying, now this is pretty much the end. The Fed, ECB saying we're going to start looking at cutting rates maybe sometime in a couple of years' time. The market saying no, 6 months or so, you can start expecting the first signs of a rate cut to start coming through. So yeah, that's an interesting little thing to look at. And finally, I'm going to end off with a little kind of tech news. And why I say tech news this week instead of AI, because it is not an AI story for a change, it's a tech story. There was a paper released like this week about what's called room temperature superconductors. What is a superconductor? Well, there's a phenomenon of certain materials that when you drop the temperature very, very low, what happens is that they are able to transport electricity without having any kind of resistance internally for various reasons, and also is able to basically repel like magnets effectively. So you can put one of them above a magnet and it'll float there because it's repelling the magnets and causing itself to be lifted up. Now, if we do have room temperature superconductors, look, it is going to be a huge benefit to society. We are talking probably one of the greatest technical achievements in science ever. We're talking something like on the level of like inventing flight. Okay, Now, this is totally different from the stuff that we've seen so far, like with AI and so on. This is another kind of like thing. People are messing around with chemistry, and they've got this thing working. Apparently, I'll come to that in a second. So, I want you to understand that this is true. This is going to be a huge, huge deal. It's not going to be something like, oh my God, something clever happened in science and we forget about it, like gravitational waves or something. No. This will impact your economies, towards jobs. It'll impact the cost of doing business around the world. It'll change the mix of energy definitely, because if you have a room temperature superconductor, there's things you can do with regards to energy that are going to be amazing. Okay, ease of transmission, the batteries that are much, much, much more efficient. Weird things like super high capacitors, etc., that are going to have multiple effects. But it's not by any means a minor deal. It's going to be revolutionary. This will be something that people will impact lives for decades, even centuries to come. Now, why do I add if it is true? Well, here's the thing. There's been a couple of these kind of claims of superconductivity at room temperature. We can do superconductivity at either at very low temperatures or room temperature with a massive amount of pressure. This is the first time we've had, if it is true, we would have had a superconductor that's basically superconductive at normal temperatures and normal pressures. That makes the cost of implementation, etc., much, much easier, as you can imagine. Now, why is this possibly, like I said, not true? Because there's been a number of announcements in this field before, and similar fields. Similar fields have been very high-end technological fields that could have huge long-term implications. The other one that comes to mind is cold fusion, which is, if it is true, going to be an incredible source of free energy for the world. Now, there is significant doubt about what's happening with this paper. There's queries about why it was published the way it was published. There's weird insider fighting among the authors about who's basically giving credit for, because there's a Nobel Prize probably on the line with this. Even though I would say that the Nobel Prize money is going to be peanuts compared to whatever the valuations that these guys are able to sell these patents for, because, like I said, an almost unlimited opportunity, probably trillions of dollars with valuation because of this particular innovation, if it is true. So what's happening right now is a number of different labs out there testing to see whether or not this thing actually works. If it does work, a good strategy would be to look at what the chemicals and what materials that go into it, and then look at basically miners that produce it, because the demand would be virtually unlimited. If it's not true, it's just another recent hit for science, where something that we think is reasonable and think is basically true is proven to be false, and and basically the reason it's proven true was effectively some scientists lied to us. So it's a very big blow to science that if this proves to be negative, we would likely see a little more, reticence among people to invest, especially in the developing markets, because of the fear that they could be scammed. Okay, that's it for this week. Thanks for having me, and I look forward to seeing you guys again next week. Cheers.